I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Russia launches an assault on the Ukrainian border in Kharkiv. We discuss Russian spycraft in the UK, the links between the Second World War and Russian atrocities today, and we interview Anna Zakletska, the Ukrainian TV presenter, singer and activist, who's one of the official commentators for Eurovision in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom, and our team is reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 10th of May, 2 years and 77 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor FrancisDearnley, chief reporter Rob Mendick, and our guest is a professor of history at Western University in London, Ontario, Oleksa Drachewych. I started by looking at the latest news from Ukraine. Russian forces are moving in the east, intensifying attacks against Kharkiv Oblast. This is a developing story, so the details at the moment are a little thin. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry has reported that during the day of May the 9th, Russian forces carried out airstrikes using guided aerial bombs towards Vovchansk. That's a town to the northeast of Kharkiv city, just a couple of miles from the border. The Defense Ministry said that in the evening of yesterday, Russian forces, quote, increased fire pressure on the front edge of our defence with the support of artillery. And at around 5 a.m. local time on May the 10th, there was an attempt by the enemy to break through our defence line under the cover of armoured vehicles. The fighting is apparently ongoing, and Ukraine has committed reserve units to the front. James Waterhouse, the BBC's Ukraine correspondent, sums it up. He wrote, Russian troops tried to break through the border in the Kharkiv region, say Ukrainian officials. The town of Vovchansk came under heavy bombing before invading scout groups, and armoured vehicles tried to punch through. His Ukrainian sources told him not a metre has been lost, but fighting is ongoing. There's also been a heavy battle in the town of Krasnohorivka in Donetsk Oblast, the town to the west of Donetsk city and southwest of Avdiivka. Russian assault groups reportedly gained entry to the town before being stopped by Ukrainian troops at the town's refractory plant. Going north for a quick snapshot in the day of the life of Sumy Oblast, on May the 9th, the Sumy Oblast military administration reported that Russian forces attacked the oblast 302 times in 60 separate attacks throughout the day, firing at 11 settlements along the border with mortars, drones, rockets and artillery, also dropping explosives from drones onto 2 of the settlements. No casualties or injuries were reported. Further south, there were 5 explosions heard across Kharkiv Oblast throughout the night. Kharkiv Mayor Ihor Terekov said on Telegram that the strikes damaged homes and started a fire. 1 person was injured. Linked to all of this, Ukraine's state-owned energy operator reported that Ukraine will face limitations on electricity usage for industry and businesses after weeks of Russian strikes against infrastructure. The Kiev Independent has a readout of the details here. They've written that the head of the state-owned energy operator has warned that imports from Europe will not be able to completely cover Ukraine's energy deficit as a result of these attacks. Energy supplies for industrial and commercial users have been restricted between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. since May the 8th. On May the 9th, the restrictions were extended to 7 a.m. the following day due to power shortages. From May the 10th, capacity limitation schedules for industrial consumers will be in effect from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m. the next day. Moving from Ukraine into Russia, Ukraine has broken records, its own records, with a long-distance strike on Russia on Thursday. They hit a target 746 miles from the border. A Ukrainian defense source said that the drone attack, which hit an oil refinery in the Russian Republic of Bashkortostan, was an SBU project and was carried out at record range. The source added that the drone had flown a total distance of 1,500 kilometers. The quote from the source, the SBU has once again proved it has powerful technological solutions that help to inflict painful blows on the enemy. Earlier, it was reported that Ukrainian drones struck 2 oil depots in Russia, causing large-scale fires. The Ukrainian intelligence official said that the depots were used as transportation hubs to supply troops in the nearby occupied peninsula of Crimea. Well, those are all the military updates. As you can hear, it's been a busy morning gathering those together. The intensity of the fighting on the front lines from Donetsk to Kharkiv has increased, and we'll keep a close eye on all of these developments and bring you another report, of course, on Monday. FrancisDearnley, can I turn to you? What's the latest diplomatically and politically?
Well, thanks very much, David. We're going to pay particular attention to Britain today, which appears set to play an increasingly significant political role in the war in the coming weeks and months ahead. Yesterday, Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, of course, gave his big foreign policy speech, laying out Britain's ambitions for the next few months. In it, unsurprisingly, he urged fellow NATO members to meet pledges to spend 2% of GDP on defence, saying a tougher foreign policy is needed in a world more dangerous than most of us have ever known. He said the West was being tested by Iran, Russia and China, among others, and that nations must show the courage or allow our adversaries to write our future for us. To quote him, "We are in a battle of wills. We all must prove our adversaries wrong, Britain and our allies and partners around the world." He went on, he said, fundamentally nations are not learning the lessons of Putin's full-scale invasion. Quote, "If Putin's illegal invasion teaches us anything, it must be that doing too little too late only spurs an aggressor on. This cannot go on. We need to be tougher and more assertive." Now, taken in unison with the promises made to the Ukrainians last week that London permits British weapons to be used by Kyiv to attack targets on Russian soil, and the significant recent donations, Britain is evidently trying to do more at this precarious time. It's still some way from denoting its red lines in the way that President Macron of France has sought to do. And in many ways, Britain has not been as prominent in its leadership role as it was under the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But these still mark significant steps. This language would have been unthinkable before the war. And indeed, I think that there are echoes in some of this terminology of what Macron has been saying in recent weeks, suggestive that perhaps London is trying to assert itself in the way that Macron has on the issue of Ukraine and European defence. Now, the other way that Britain seems set to become increasingly significant, at least in the back corridors of Europe, is in persuading other powers to give Ukraine the weapons it needs. Valery Zaluzhny has now been officially appointed as Ukraine's new ambassador to the UK after his name was put forward. And sources suggest he will be taking up post over the next few weeks. No one knows better than him the military situation, given, of course, his role as former commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Ukraine, nor how weapons can be best used on the ground. So his appointment here suggests that he will play a significant role in the diplomacy in trying to encourage Europe via London to give more. Rest assured, we've put in to interview him once he is officially in post. Now, to those not following the intricacies of British politics, and if so, I envy you, it is worth saying that polling here suggests that the Conservatives, the governing party, that is the party of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and of course the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, will not win the next election, which most expect to take place around the end of this year, around the time of the US presidential election now. That means that Labour, led by Sir Keir Starmer, will most likely take over. Now, on Ukraine, Labour has promised a continuation and perhaps even an increase in its support for Kyiv. Here, Ukraine is nowhere near as much as a partisan political issue as it is in the United States. And yet, Labour does have a wing on its far left. Labour is a left-wing party, which is opposed to military interventions for ideological reasons. So they may, and I hesitate to say may, because I think most people are expecting a sizable majority for the moderates within Keir Starmer's Labour Party, but nonetheless, it's important to say this, may have some sway. So Labour's foreign policy may undergo some changes depending on what the result is in that election. So more on that, of course, as it occurs, but there is no yet date set on when the general election will be here in Britain. Now, just the final story I want to focus on relates once again to the issue of sanctions and their evasion. Regular listeners will recall that last year, and as recently as several months ago, there were major concerns within Russia that its commercial airlines might be forced to stop operating en masse due to the absence of official spare parts from Western manufacturers. Well, the Financial Times has done an investigation into this, which is a detailed examination of what is currently happening It's a very detailed piece, but its essence is that before Russia invaded Ukraine, its airlines got spare parts directly from Boeing and Airbus. But now they are being obliged to buy them from international smugglers, which is ensuring that the planes are still flying using unofficial parts. So Boeing, in the piece, is cited as saying there are no legal routes for Russia to receive its components. But as the FT says, quote, the problems caused by the sanctions were extinguished with a flood of money. The airlines had the opportunity to buy parts for more money in smaller volumes and of lower quality, but still meeting the minimum safety threshold. Now, the UAE is a central hub of this trade, according to the FT, with parts getting through via countries not sanctioning Moscow. The number of flights is now around the pre-war level. And whilst in the long run, it's expected that many planes will become unserviceable with these quick fixes effectively not being sustainable, it speaks to yet another area in which sanctions have not proven effective due to loopholes. So for those interested in the sanctions issue, I highly recommend this long read. It's very, very interesting, and we'll add a link in the description.
Well, thank you very much, Francis, for your reporting there. Let's go to our chief reporter then, Rob Mendick. Rob, earlier this week we covered the news that Russia's defence attaché is to be expelled from the United Kingdom after James cleverly identified him as a spy. He's been named Maxim Elevik, a colonel in the Russian military. You've been all over this story this week. We just covered the news. Can you give us some of the background, the colour, the details that I think would be appreciated by our listeners? Tell us more about Maxim and a little bit maybe about some of the properties that have been confiscated as well.
I'm going to wind the clock back a bit, if you don't mind, to 2018, which I think is the context for some of this. And that's the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury with Novichok, which is often described as weapons-grade nerve agent, although I'm yet to find a normal non-weapons-grade nerve agent, if truth be told. And at the time, our response was pretty decent. We expelled 23 diplomats. And I think our security services were pretty confident that we dismantled a great chunk of Russia's spying capability in the UK, if not all of it. And I think that what we've seen in the last 5-6 years and recently is a regrouping by the Russians, a different way of doing things. So that while they had 23 spies here at the time and they could do untoward things, of which the Skripal thing was extraordinary, they are now, I think, acts by what might be called proxy, really. Which is getting other people to do them. Which is why we get on to Maxim Elevik, who was remaining official spy, if you like, left in the UK, and now we've booted him out. And that's in response to what looks like an upping of activity in the UK by Russia post-Skripal. So the first time we've seen some proper plotting by the Russians here, and it revolves around a couple of cases that we know about, but I can't tell you too much about because they're subject to court cases coming up here. So we have these sort of very tight contempt laws in the UK that make it difficult. But one involves, and James cleverly revealed this when he said we're booting out Maxim Elevik the other day, and one involves the arrest and charging of 6 Bulgarians. Can't say too much about that because there is a trial coming up. The other is charging of 5 other people in relation to a warehouse fire associated to Ukraine in East London by mercenaries recruited through the Wagner Group, I think. And again, a trial will examine that further. But what it tells us is that the Russians, post-Skripal, have been asleep a bit and have now woken up, I think. And so we've booted out Maxim Elevik because we think that things are going on. And the other thing we've done is look at these various properties. And it turns out, and we knew this but never really properly examined it, the Russian Federation has quite a property portfolio in the UK that's worth tens of millions. One of which is the Seacocks Heath, which is a 50-room sort of giant mansion. Is there any other kind of mansion? On the Kent-Sussex borders, south of London, for those readers who aren't familiar with the Kent-Sussex borders. And it's tucked away behind trees, high fences. And it's basically Russia's Dasha in the south of England. And it was a place that was gifted to the Soviet Union in 1946 as a thank you for their part in defeating the Nazis by a family of Viscount Goshen, who was a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who built this mansion in 1871. It's a terrific looking place, and you'd be happy to go there for your summer holidays. And in the Soviet times, Soviet officials would pack their children off in the summer just as they would for the normal dasher out in wherever. and they'd go and join them at weekends and all the rest of it. But what the British say is that this place is being used for intelligence gathering and attacks and plotting. And so we've removed its diplomatic status, which would mean that police could now go and raid the place if they wanted to. It's all about making the Russians just that bit more uncomfortable. They've removed diplomatic status from some other buildings too, these ones in Hampstead, which is another slice of basically Russian territory in the middle of London, which in itself is an odd thing. The British government said they were in Highgate, which is a bit of London. Actually, they're in Hampstead, overlooking Hampstead Ponds, which are famous sort of swimming ponds. And there were giant offices for a Russian trade delegation, and Maxim Elikov's office of the Russian defence attaché was also there. It's a pretty large plot that's worth several million quid. I mean, it's proper prime real estate. They'll be surrounded by actors in Hampstead and all sorts of very wealthy business people and the like, as well as several Russians. And the government has said, enough's enough. We're stripping you of diplomatic status, and that means that we as the police can raid it when we want to. You can't carry on doing nefarious things under cover of diplomatic protection, and this is effectively no longer Russian sovereign territory in London. We'll await to see what the Russians do in retaliation, but they'll boot out our defence attaché from Moscow. The British, I think, realise and recognise that we need an embassy and a consulate in Moscow ourselves, and we need to keep those lines open. So it's as far as we were prepared to go. Elevate is the first spy we've booted out since 2018, since those 23 diplomats were expelled post-Skral. So it shows trying to stay on top of things, but it also shows the Russians have moved tactics, that they're using others, Bulgarians, British nationals, to do their bidding, and it gives them a kind of plausible deniability when things go wrong. Iran have always used that tactic. Iran loves to get a sort of take an Eastern European gang, fly them in, do something nefarious and fly them out again, and then the Iranian regime could say it wasn't us, gov. And the Russians have moved that post. I don't suppose we know the half of what they've been up to. We get bits and bobs, and when people get charged, then we get to hear about it.
Rob, you answered all of my questions really before I asked them there. Thank you so much for talking us through that. Just one question from me. As you said, there are reporting restrictions. We've got to be very, very careful. What should our listeners know about where this story goes next?
Well, there's a very high-profile court case start in the autumn off the top of my head, which is these Bulgarians. And I would be watching that one with great interest, and that'll be fascinating. I think the Wagner Group plot, for want of a better way of putting it, of this arson attack on a Ukrainian-linked warehouse in East London will take a bit longer. Those charges are fresher. British justice can work a little slowly, and equally these are complicated plots that need unpicking and investigating. So that's where that bit goes. But I think I would also be looking out for other bits of... I think we'll just be on the watch now for peculiar activity. If these latest actions and a warning to shot across the Russian ambassador's bows to say, stop what you're doing, we're on to you, that might help. But the Russians are clearly emboldened, and I'm not certain. There's a funny little sort of adjunct I'm thinking about the Seacox Heath thing, where in post the invasion of Ukraine, the locals who spotted that this was a sort of strange Russian enclave in there next to their village of Hawkhurst started planting Ukrainian flags outside the entrance into the mansion, the driveway. The Russians, there's a couple of Russian caretakers, I think, in there. They started buzzing the local villagers with drones just to annoy them because they were so cross about the Ukrainian flags being planted outside their driveway, and buzzing them during the day and in the night. It was freaking everyone out. And obviously the police were powerless to act. Well, the drones will have to stop.
Rob Mendick, thank you so much for bringing us your report there. We'll come back to you for a final thought. Oleksa, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really good to have you on. Would you just like to start by introducing yourself and your work to our listeners?
Yes, thank you. First, thanks for having me on. Yes, so I've been spending the last about 2 years now developing a manuscript that's currently now going through peer review that compares and contrasts Soviet atrocities during and after the Second World War and what Russia has committed, the atrocities they've committed in Ukraine today. And in there, I make the argument that if we're going to talk about historical memory, and many scholars have talked about how Russia today is replaying the Second World War, we also need to include the issue of atrocities. The challenge there, though, is that Russia today, for example, does not talk about the atrocities that the Red Army committed or that the NKVD committed. And so it's trying to figure out to what extent they are being inspired by what happened when we know individuals like Putin and other leaders at least consider themselves amateur historians. And what I have found is that we can look at a couple of things. So first off, that there are a number of direct parallels where we can see very similar, if not almost identical events taking place, which can be instructive in helping us explain why Russian forces are committing atrocities, what is happening, things like that. But also there are a handful of implicit and explicit inspirations where we can see a straight line connection. And my manuscript looks to, one, highlight all of this while also opening the door to a discussion about how history can help us understand events today, but also how historical memory does play a role in also, well, the atrocities that we're seeing Russia commit in Ukraine today.
Well, Oleksa, let's jump straight in then. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the events in the Second World War perpetuated by the Red Army and put them alongside what you're seeing in Ukraine today?
Yeah, so I'll maybe start by giving a quick overview of the structure of the book to show kind of the scope, is that I've basically developed 5 chapters based off of themes or certain events. So the first chapter is looking at denazification, the actual processes of denazification. Again, we have heard how Putin and Russia have frequently claimed that they are denazifying Ukraine, and we know that obviously that claim does not meet reality here. However, they are drawing on a specific history. So one is that establishing that history, but in doing so also there are the connections with regards to the Orthodox Church taking a similar role today as the Orthodox Church did during the Second World War. The next chapter focuses on sexual violence, in which the accounts that we are getting from Ukraine are very similar to what the Red Army perpetrated on the Eastern Front in 1944, 1945. And I should also just quickly at this point highlight that while unfortunately atrocities are not unique to this situation, they happen in virtually every war, where I think that this is a useful parallel in this case for all of these examples is that, one, there's that historical memory connection, but it also helps us explain what could happen, what might happen going forward, what are the consequences, simply because there are very similar operations between the two. From there, I go into issues of mass violence towards civilians. What really started me on this topic was when I saw some of the satellite and aerial photos of Bucha. I immediately thought of the Katyn massacre and the aerial photos there. And so there's also the history of looting that the Red Army perpetrates. There are some connections there, but also limitations to the comparison, and that terror bombing is something that the Russian forces are doing a lot more today than the Soviets did during the Second World War, although there are examples of that. Helsinki, Budapest, Berlin, obviously. And then looking at population transfers, Russification being a big aspect to Russia's war in Ukraine today. We obviously know of the transfer of people with regards to Crimea. Obviously, there is the direct connection there with regards to the forced transfer of the Crimean Tatars during the Second World War. So there's a direct historical connection there, but also there are a variety of their population transfers, and related to that is also the filtration camps that we are also hearing about that Russia is using today in Ukraine. And finally, I also look at weaponization of food in a couple of different ways. Many historians have highlighted the connections and the parallels to the Holodomor. Again, how the historical memory of the Holodomor in Ukraine is resonating with Ukrainians, but I also think that the famine of 1946 and 47 is instructive because, for example, the Soviets used that to allow them to bring to heel the Ukrainian nationalist movement then. And we're seeing, obviously, Russia attempting to crush the Ukrainian state in some way, shape, or form, both through committing various forms of ethnic cleansing, but also committing genocidal acts. And all of that sort of comes into this study. I also discuss things like the issue of children, where there isn't a clear parallel. However, things like the Komsomol, things like how these youth groups that Putin is starting to revive, they also have direct Soviet parallels. So again, there's a lot of different aspects. And every time, I always say to people when I'm talking about this, is Russian officials are also making it much clearer that they are drawing more and more on this history, and sometimes it's in very small ways. To give a very example, Kharkiv last fall spoke about how, with regards to some of the penal regiments using criminals to go to the front line, to fight in Ukraine, he explicitly says that, quote, they will atone for their sins with their blood, which is a direct quote of Stalin's speech when he issues Order Number 227, which is more well known as the Not One Step Back Order. Coupled with that, he also discusses the formation of penal battalions. So you see these direct, where they're clearly drawing from this history to also justify their events, their actions today.
There's so much to get into here. Oleksa, to what extent do you think this is cosplaying? That to some extent, because this is the historical memory, because as we know, Putin has made so much of the Great Patriotic War, that there's almost no other way in which you could act. And to what extent do you think ordinary soldiers on the ground believe this? And to what extent is this just an elite obsession?
I think it's a little bit of both, in the sense that very clearly that a lot of what's motivating, especially some of the historical memory, is the leadership, whether it's definitely the political leadership. More than likely there is some military buy-in, but I also think that there are enough now accounts that have come out through various reporting, but also through bodies like Human Rights Watch, even the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights through the UN, that suggest that Russian troops on the ground have at least internalized some of this history. So one of the arguments that I make, for example, is that by dehumanizing Ukrainians in a very similar way that the Soviets dehumanized the Nazis, by highlighting for at least the Germans, Nazi Germany committed extensive atrocities against the Soviet Union. That's not the case with regards to Ukraine, but they're drawing on that memory by claiming that Ukraine is committing a genocide in the Donbass, that they are trying to eliminate all of the Russians that live in Ukraine. They're drawing on this to try to get an emotional response, and then adding that history of Nazism. This is something that, again, many in Russia will have become very familiar with. This is something that they have built up, not just under Putin, but it goes back to this memory, this importance of the Soviet defeat of Nazism, which became the Russian defeat of Nazism. This is something that has been part of Russian and Soviet historical memory for some time. So it's all familiar. And there are a number of examples where Russian troops in Ukraine will basically dehumanize Ukrainian civilians by calling them Nazis, by stating, for example, that they won't be able to procreate, especially after sexual violence, that they're doing things like that, where this is identical to what the Soviets cultivated. And this dehumanization, while the average Russian soldier, for example, might not be aware of or at least the scope of Red Army atrocities, the actions that Putin, that state media, and whoever else might be issuing orders are leading to the same results in some way, shape, or form. And so that dehumanization, I think, is a key aspect of this, and they are essentially in many ways drawing from that playbook. And much like Nazi Germany needed to be defeated and humiliated and brought to heel, so too should Russian troops do to Ukraine.
Oleksa, when you talk about the Soviets, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and shares in that history. Millions of Ukrainian soldiers fought Nazi Germany as well. So why do you think this way of thinking about warfare persists in Russia but doesn't so much in Ukraine?
That's a fantastic question, and it's something that I keep thinking about, and the broad sort of academic community. Why has Ukraine gone on such a different path than Russia? And there's a couple of potential avenues of thought. One is that Ukraine committed much more to democratic methods and democracy than Russia did. Russia slid back into autocracy, especially during the 1990s. Both nations had economic difficulties. Ukraine, however, managed incrementally, even through great challenge. Both Ukrainians and the Ukrainian state managed to do things to ensure that there would be a liberal democracy that would develop. Liberal democracies, while they also do commit atrocities too, when I talk about the Second World War, the United States, Britain, they also have a history of having committed atrocities during the Second World War as well. But more than likely, there is an impression that at least they will be brought to justice for these atrocities. And we see this with Ukraine today, is that when there are credible reports of human rights abuses committed by Ukrainian soldiers, for example, Zelensky is very clear that there needs to be some sort of ramifications and consequences for that. And this is something the world is watching very closely. That's one possible avenue. There is another argument that I have seen, and I'm less convinced by it, but I'll share it, which is this idea that, especially after 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and started the war in the Donbass, Ukraine has engaged in significant military reforms. as a result of especially the influence of, say, Western governments helping train and things like this. This has led then to a military that is much more decentralized, in which there is also significant discipline amongst troops, that units follow military discipline, and these are things that are common. Militaries that fall into these things of having a decentralized order, strong bond between comrades, all of that can help prevent atrocities because it will not be, for example, approved by their officer. The problem with that is that Russia engaged in similar reforms in the 2010s. And I think really what the answer there is that we assume Putin obviously played a big role in the escalation in February 2022, and that he is probably taking a major role in also a lot of how the actual Russian forces are being deployed and things like that. And that re-centralized, brought back the old sort of Soviet-style army that they tried to undo. The problem there is we just don't know. There's a lot of speculation in that, but ultimately a lot of it comes down to Ukraine following a different path and its soldiers being better disciplined. And so that's where we look to things like the democratic nature of Ukraine, but also the better discipline, the better lasting reforms of Ukraine, things like that.
I can imagine quite a few listeners will be nodding along with your analysis there. Can I ask, how does your book, how does your thinking, how does your analysis of this help us better understand what may happen in the future, help us better understand why the war is developing in the way it is?
So a couple of things. So first off is that at the very least, even just by considering what the Red Army did, and especially afterwards. So for example, we know of the extensive sexual violence that Russian forces have committed. Obviously, we know of the extensive sexual violence Red Army forces committed during the Second World War. Afterwards, there was a number of sort of results. One is that especially when we talk about things like ethnic cleansing and genocide, we have to also be aware that there is a Russification of especially the Ukrainian female population through any pregnancies that, for example, happen. And one of the things that is only just starting to be better understood, especially in the last decade or so, in say, for example, Germany and Hungary, is that there is a whole generation of what were colloquially termed and pejoratively called, quote, Russian kids. That there was a generation of children where their parents, their mother, had been assaulted by the Red Army. And these children had everything from behavioral issues to feelings of abandonment to also attempts to try to actually find out who their father was. And it really then led to also strain on the family. And this is just one example of something that Ukraine is going to have to also consider. Along with that, when we talk about, for example, Russian occupation, one of the things that the Soviets did is in Eastern Europe, especially with the influence of over the Eastern Bloc, is these atrocities just weren't talked about. So you also have a generation that is then silenced from what they survived. And this also plays a role in, again, how trauma becomes intergenerational, how trauma also becomes a silent struggle for a lot of individuals. We have a good sense of what Russian forces have been doing in occupied territories. But when Ukraine liberated more territory, we then found out that the scope was often more. And that's one thing that, again, we don't know. But we're looking at events, for example, like what the Red Army did. And this is just one example. This sort of tells us sort of things to look out for, things to be prepared about. Things like the sexual health of the nation is going to be something significant. There's already discussions about demographic issues in Ukraine as well. And also just, again, depending on how traumatizing the experience was, it will lead to families potentially breaking up. It will lead to feelings of humiliation and shame. It will also lead to issues of desexualization, where some individuals may no longer engage in sex, which also then has the result of playing to issues of, again, ethnic cleansing and things like this, where if Ukraine cannot continue on and future generations cannot develop, these are all things that can add up and will imprint themselves on how Ukraine goes forward. And it's also why I think that any calls for peace without considerations of justice, without considerations of the social ramifications of what has happened, is only going to ensure that there will be continued animus between the two nations, and for Ukraine, rightfully so, with Russia invading. But again, if there's any hope for lasting peace, there has to be some way to deal with the atrocities that have happened, the trauma that has occurred, to avoid, again, that silencing that happened for decades during the Cold War, in the Eastern Bloc.
Oleksa, it's Francis here. Thank you very much for your time. You mentioned the Cold War there, and actually I wanted to just shift subject slightly onto that, because I know you're also an expert in global communism. And one of the most interesting things, I think, when we look at modern Russia versus perhaps Russia during the Cold War period, is that, of course, in the Cold War period, Russia is trying to export an ideology which is by its very nature transnational. Communism is not rooted in an innate nationalism, but in this idea of the Front International, and that communism doesn't need to be rooted in any one culture. So connected to that, I suppose I wanted to ask your view as an expert on that period. In what ways do you think, if at all, but do you think that Putinism itself can be a foreign export? Is it something that has a universality as well? Or do you think that this imperialism will only ever be, as it were, a danger to Russia and its immediate neighbours?
So, again, another great question. With that, I would say it's not so much Putinism that might be exported, but the ideas of this sort of civilizational struggle that is at the heart of especially how Putin and Russian officials, especially they speak to the West. We've seen them courting, for example, the global South on a broader scale. And this is drawing on the long history of Soviet anti-imperialism, but also, again, the sort of obfuscation of Soviet imperialism, that Russia is basically trying to draw on this history of Soviet and then later Russian support for Africa, for Latin America, for Southeast Asia, and hoping that that will then lead to, again, this bloc. Putin has wanted to develop a multipolar world for many, many years, and he's wanting to place Russia in that leadership position. And I think that's where the dangerous part is, that by developing these relationships with the global South, it's only going to further, again, split the world in some way. Now, to be also very, very clear here, the nations in the global South are not a monolith, one. And two, many of them are caught in this situation, and we can see this through UN votes, for example, that many are abstaining on votes as a way of protest. They may not openly go against, for example, Russia, but they won't support what they're doing. And this is mainly for a reason of, in some cases, political reasons. They require Russian support for their own political stability, or economic reasons, is that they have significant economic ties with Russia or China. And as a result, they can't afford to rock the boat too much for fear of local disruptions and things like this. And this is also where the long history of Western imperialism plays a role. Russia and China can act as they're not tainted by that, never mind the fact that Russia has a long history of imperialism. But they utilize this history that you mentioned, especially during the Cold War and prior to that. So the area I happen to know even better is the Comintern period, the 1920s and 1930s. And they are developing this idea that Russia and China could be this leader of a multipolar world to stand up to the West and especially the United States. There's also a reason why I think they also focus on Britain so much in their present day rhetoric, is again tying into that imperial past as well as convenient. And along with the long history of perceived English Russophobia. And all of that plays a role into sort of how I think Putin sees the world. He wants to go back to this Cold War-esque system, but one in which the majority of the population of the world through the global South is supporting him and supporting this restructuring of the world where the West and liberal internationalism, or whatever you want to, the liberal world order, would then be under siege by whatever Russia and China try to lead with economically, politically, and so forth.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Oleksa. I just wanted to add one thought to that, which is, in a sense, you're saying that the threat is realpolitik as opposed to ideological, in a sense, in terms of how Russia operates today versus in the Cold War. My one added to that is that I would argue the danger of Putinism is not, as you say, in an ideological sense, because it is very difficult to try and encourage that idea, which is so rooted in the idea of Russia internationally. But what can be exported is the idea of an authoritarian leader who has strength, who mobilizes an almost fascistic culture at home. And that becomes something that countries want to emulate because it has been successful. So if Russia is allowed to be successful in Ukraine, then the model model of which Russia has created in order to enable that will become something that other countries will look at and say, well, if Russia can achieve it, then maybe that model is successful. It reminds me of the Benjamin Franklin quote where he says that the danger for America, or the danger for democracy, is not what others do to it, I'm paraphrasing here, but what it does to itself. And it's that idea that countries begin to change to emulate what is successful. And maybe that's the danger of countries like Russia and China, is that we try and emulate their collective models rather than pursuing a kind of idea of individual liberty, because we fear that they are becoming increasingly powerful because of a more successful model than our own. But it's a fascinating subject.
And I think that's a very fair point. And I would also just add, just as in this is a bit of a reductionist sort of addition to that, but even when we look at the interwar period, part of what emboldens Hitler to engage on actually acting on his aims in Eastern Europe and feeling that he can actually push up against the League of Nations and can push up against the British and the French is when Italy invades Abyssinia and Europe largely allows it to happen. That helps embolden Hitler to then realize, hey, I can do these things. And so I think that there's a very good point there in that again, if Putin is not checked, it encourages other powers to then see what they can potentially push back on. And we've already seen a little bit of that with Azerbaijan, and where again, even smaller powers are going, okay, where can they operate to deal with some long-standing issues and things like that.
Oleksa, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
The other thing I would just add is that one of the other things that I've also written on is how peace is elusive. And I just want to, again, I would always just stress is that always think about what is happening under Russian occupation. That is often beyond sort of the military realities, one of the key issues here. And is that for anyone seriously thinking about how there's going to be lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine, there has to be the issue of justice. These atrocities have taken place and they are of significant scope. And the reality is, and I'll paraphrase Francine Hirsch, who's a historian who wrote a fantastic book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg. And she made an argument a couple of years ago in an op-ed piece that the Soviet Union never really was punished for the atrocities they committed during the Second World War. And she makes the case that because of that, Putin and Russian leaders today believe that they can get away with it again. That if they are never brought to justice, it encourages the behavior again and again. How Russia will be brought to justice, I'll admit, I have very few ideas, especially when Russia doesn't recognize the ICC. But the hope is that at some point that there might be the opportunity, whether it's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether it is something through the ICC, whether it is somehow, some way, again, I don't know how at the moment, it's hard for me to see it, where there might be a Russian government that might be willing to basically face justice for what they've done. But the reality is that that's going to be one of the key issues, I think, no matter when and how the Russia's war in Ukraine is resolved. The fact is that this is going to be a key issue in Eastern Europe for many, many years to come because of that issue.
Thank you so much for your time, Oleksa. Your final thoughts, please.
We're now over 2 years since the escalation. This has been a war that's been happening since 2014. Just that, don't forget what's happening in Ukraine. I'm so thankful for podcasts like this that keep attention on what is happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing to Ukraine and in Ukraine, that there is plenty of evidence to suggest that there is at least ethnic cleansing, if not genocidal intent here, that there's an imperial war happening, and that ultimately at some point Russia will need to be brought to justice. But the only way that can happen sooner rather than later is for the support that Ukraine has gotten to continue. And so I just hope that the rumblings, that support might be waning in certain areas, again, coming from Canada, obviously looking to my southern border and what might be happening in the United States, depending on the presidential election there. And that gives me great concern. But just to keep attention on this to ensure that, one, we know what is happening and that we don't forget what is happening, what Russia is doing to Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Rob and Oleksa. Francis, on a slightly lighter note to end the episode, I'm going to go to you as our official Eurovision correspondent for your final thoughts.
Thank you, David. It would be remiss not to mention the world's premiere song contest, wouldn't it? I've had several listeners reach out and ask whether I'll be attending, as I did in Liverpool last year when the UK hosted the competition on Ukraine's behalf. Regrettably not, so listeners will be spared my overexcited backstage tweeting from last year, but I will be watching it on Saturday, and I've already watched several of the big acts. Ukraine's entry is through to the final, and the main chorus, it's rather rousing, though I'm not entirely convinced by the rapping segment, I'm sorry to say. Croatia are in the mix as a possible winner, I'd say, as are Finland. Britain's never quite lifts off, and the less said about Ireland's screeching contest, the better. But obviously there is a serious side to all this. For Ukraine, it offers an opportunity to display its defiance to the world, that despite everything, Kyiv stands. That matters when the audience is so huge, 162 million viewers last year. In the past two contests, Ukraine has featured very prominently indeed. So it'll be interesting to see whether, at this stage of the war, reference is made to that again. Ukrainians, of course, are big Eurovision fans, and for today's interview going out in this episode, I talked to Anna Zakletska, one of the official commentators of the contest in Ukraine, who references that, as well as many other subjects, including Ukrainian paganism, which is an interesting subject we've not yet covered. But I digress. If you want to join in the fun on Saturday, if you share with me your photos of you watching the competition wherever you are in Europe or around the world, I promise I will respond on Twitter. If nothing else, it should be a laugh. One day, I will try and drag Dom along. For him, I imagine Eurovision is far more of a hostile environment than being in a tank or a helicopter.
Thank you very much, Francis. And just to all of our wonderful Irish listeners, please feel free to contact Francis directly. You don't need to go through the podcast email for that. Just FrancisDearnley. And let us know, of course, Francis, the kind of responses you get. As Francis mentioned in his final thought, for today's interview, he sits down with Anna Zakletska, the Ukrainian TV presenter, singer, and activist. Anna is one of the official commentators in Ukraine at Eurovision on Saturday. In a wide-ranging interview at the fundraiser for the charity Ukrainian Action, they discussed the song contest, folklore, and her work for organisations helping Ukrainians deal with trauma. This is their conversation.
I am lucky to belong to the group of people who have always been very into Ukrainian folklore culture, into a very authentic things, into pre-Christian history and traditions. So I'm just lucky to be in this environment since I was born, as my mother is a professional singer in national choir of Grigori Verevka. And this is academic, but national traditional music. It's very well known in Ukraine, and maybe you can Google and see it. They are very nice. And my father has been always in the group of people who fight it for Ukrainian identity, for the right to be free in what to create, not to write about Communist Party of Soviet Union, but to develop absolutely different kind of level of culture and, as a matter of fact, level of living in quality. So our environment has always been like full of classics, live people who are right now very well known in Ukraine, like Nina Matviyenko or Yevhen Sverstyuk or Vyacheslav Chernovil or Anatoly Haidamaka. Those are like bohemian Ukrainian people who wrote books, who painted beautiful things, who represented Ukraine all over the globe. And I was just a small girl listening and watching them all the time. And I was lucky to observe it from the very childhood. And my dad has always told me that this war will start because culture matters, language matters, you'll see, and they will use the argument for language to come to save their people, to create the illusion of unique market, unique space. And that's why we've been always exploring pagan culture, we've been always exploring our traditions, we've been always speaking Ukrainian. Many artists, unlike Oleg Skripka, chose to sing in Russian because it's a big market, it's huge. You can travel and get money. And also the factor of so-called fifth column, that Russia never saved money for propaganda. They picked people and made their life luxury. So whenever you see something attached to Russia, it's always huge, posh, very expensive cars, expensive everything. And they did their best to do the completely opposite things to people who were actually the barriers of Ukrainian national interests, like old cars, bad apartment. We were the group, and still are, a group of volunteers, artists who would travel to frontline with the concerts for military and civilians of Ukraine, because it is a problem in Ukraine that so many people have never been farther than their own yard. And when they watch Russian television, where they say, oh, be afraid of European Union because it's, gays will eat you, or some absolutely absurd and stupidity. But if they don't see it, they start believing. And if they are brought up in the conditions of no critical thinking, then they don't have this habit to analyze, they don't have this habit to act. And that's why we had number of different projects, festivals and things like that, to actually reveal those skills to people, that if something is dirty around you, you actually can stand up and clean it. If you don't like something, you actually have a constitution where it's written that you can go to your member of parliament, or you can become member of parliament. If you don't like corruption, stop doing it on the lowest level. Start paying taxes.
You have to educate people to be active citizens after being oppressed for such a long period of time.
Exactly, and it's long-term plan. It's not easy, but especially working with the children, you don't have to remake something. You can just give them the perspective and the options, but they can choose them consciously, not just by pattern that was given from above, like in Soviet Union. Unfortunately for Ukrainians, it's a very high price to come to its identity, to protect our land. For many people, actually, to start value freedom and everything that we had. So I pray that we will be wise enough to make right conclusions, not to go in circles again and again, because in our history the situation happened before. And we hope that this is the last war.
We'll come to your work with women and families in a moment, but just staying on culture, you are a broadcaster. Talk to me about the broadcasting landscape in Ukraine today, because of course it's gone through a lot of changes in the last 10 years or so, and even in this period of the full-scale invasion.
Oh yes, it was the strategic plan, I think, of both Fifth Column with the legs growing from Russia, to buy national popular channels by people who control and who start making content for their interest, which is logical. And National Broadcasting Company, where I work, it was discredited step by step. But in 2017, we finally came up with the reform for public broadcasting. And so far it's very successful. The team of people who are managing it, fantastic. Of course, there are some inner intrigues or conflicts everywhere. But you can feel it that those people are connected by the idea and ideology and national interests, which are actually national security. And beginning with the full-scale invasion, these commercial channels who used to belong to oligarchs finally lost their high ratings. And right now we feel investigations show that National Broadcasting Company has the number one trust of Ukrainians, and we value it very much. We try to do our best not to lose it and to stick to the highest standards of journalism, of course.
I've just come back from Ukraine, and it was something quite noteworthy, I think, to see the number of programs, documentaries, interviews, and also soap dramas about men coming back from war and how their families are dealing with that. Now, that's actually an area that you're dealing with in real life, not in fiction. So can you tell me a little bit about those projects that you're working on?
Well, the most important project for me in that context is definitely the platform for psychological help women and war. Because my concept and my idea is that rebuild bricks, roads, schools, whatever material is much more easier than rebuild the soul. And the whole country is definitely in trauma now, even those people who went abroad because of the full-scale invasion. The level of the trauma is different, but still it is there. And we have to be so attentive to what we are joking about, to what we are saying, because something can be a trigger to a very aggressive thing. And another thing is about why did we choose women to work with? Because when the full-scale invasion started, I worked as a psychologist with the military groups. And at some point I understood that they need to be so strong. And when I work with them and push on some vulnerable buttons, it just makes them soft, makes them sensitive, and it's controversial to the situation that we had. But what they have at home, people who are waiting for them, their families, mostly wives. It's not that we are very conservative about that it's just women and just men. But for those people who have to know in a new way how to communicate with them, especially when they are after the battle, when they don't want to touch, when they don't want to talk, because it's a nightmare that you would not wish to anyone. When they see death, when they see blood, and if he doesn't go out with the garbage as he used to do before, we need to understand how to communicate. It's not like to become silent or talk to me, but know how to actually formulate this. Like, I see that you are maybe tired right now, and maybe you don't want to talk about something. But in case you want, I am here. And it's fine that you don't want to do something. So just to speak. But it's something new that we need to learn. And it's including with the children, as I told you. Don't laugh very much loud when you're in public, please. Because for someone it can be very annoying. Because those people are back from battle, understanding that rules of communication need to be changed, because there are so many people who lived through the nightmare and who still do.
And of course you're describing there a process, a phenomenon that took place in Europe after the Second World War. It's something that's quite familiar here. People talk about their parents or their grandparents and their inability to communicate, the trauma.
I remember my grandma, she never liked to talk about the Second World War. Never. It was like living through it again. And on one hand, right now as a psychologist, I understand that I don't want to push her. On the other hand, I'm so grateful that she did, because I know it from the first person who experienced. She was 70-something when she talked to me about it. Can you imagine? And she lived through the Second World War when she was 18. So it's like a huge period of time passed, but she still was in such a bad place to talk about it. It was still very painful. And this is something that we also have to take into consideration.
Well, on to a very grim subject, to something a little bit lighter and a different historical period entirely. I know you're fascinated by, as you were referencing earlier on, ancient Ukraine, in essence, pre-Christian Ukraine. This is a subject I know that Professor Timothy Snyder, who'll be familiar with many listeners, is also very much fascinated in and is writing a book about at the moment. So stay tuned on that. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about this theme. But can you tell me about where that interest comes from and what it was like in that period? What was Ukraine in the ancient times?
Oh, I think that we don't have enough time to listen to those stories from me, because I adore this topic and I love talking about it. But to make it brief, actually, I am about to publish my book as well. And it's not a scientific book, but the decision was made because due to Ukrainian history always torn between empires, and Soviet Union made its job really good to cut the roots, to assimilate people, to change their names, to lie them about their history, to take away their real estate and their belongings. And right now, Christianity became like basement for our culture. And that's why 10 years ago I started to write these stories of my grandmother. Right now she's not with us anymore, but I have them recorded and written. And it's going to be a book soon. Because I wanted to be that grandmother for my grandchildren. So they have this family book with these beliefs, which are native for our family, and also with the events that it's happening around me. So it's not that I'm retelling someone's story, but if someone in 100 years will come and say, no Russians came to invade you, they can, you see? Grandmother.
You have a record of...
Yes, so it's something that I'm living and watching. And as for this pre-Christian culture, it's a very multi-layer topic, and it's impossible to say in a few words. But I will try to tell you that you see me wearing red, black, and also white is there. And the brand is called Stry. In Ukraine right now they use it for different meanings. One is to be in good shape. Another one is actually clothes. Both meanings are right, but the etymology is fantastic. You hear it even in English, stry, like tree. It's about 3 dimensions of our life. First one in the black dimension, it's the world of potential, darkness without light, where roots are growing. When you wear black, you activate energy of creation. It's perfect canvas for creation because you choose where to put light, what colors to choose and to show. So it's called Nava, lower roots world. The next level is Yava. It's what you see, proyavleny, and it's red. It's the level of living, of passion, of love, of energy, of creativity, of being seen. I'm very bright when I wear red, but also there's a tweak. If I want to hide, I also can wear red because you will pay attention to this, but not to my face or my emotion. So you can play with that. And the white world is opposite to the black one. If black is absence of light, then white is presence of all the spectrum, as you know from physics. Depending on the angle of the ray, if you have this diamond. So this presence of all the potential in on dimensions that is already existing. And tree, stry, is actually about three, it's all one root words. And it's about integrity. When in Ukrainian language, when we speak about being in a good shape, we say strunky or stroyny. It all has same root, because string by the way is struna. When you are not too relaxed or not too stressed, you can play your own melody. And when stroyny, it's also stroyety, to build. Stroyny means in good shape, so it's about being integrated, being whole, in the meaning of wholeness, when roots, light, and all energies are balanced. So you play your own melody without faults. You hear your string just the way it should be, not comparing to any others, not lying to yourself. It's very interesting, and it's just one branch of this multi-layer topic of Ukrainian pagan culture that I can really speak a lot.
It's a fascinating subject, and one that I'd love to return to with you when the book is out. Listeners will know my love of ancient history, so you're definitely preaching to the converted here. Just to end on another subject that listeners will know I've got an affinity for, which is Eurovision. I understand this year that you will be there doing that coverage for the national broadcaster. It's in Malmö in Sweden. Are you looking forward to it? Are you a big Eurovision fan? And what does it mean to Ukraine now? It has very much been something that has been a core part, I think, of the cultural understanding of Ukraine in the last few years.
Exactly. It's like cultural diplomacy on the first place. And Eurovision is a very popular contest in Ukraine. And we have so many discussions like, maybe we shouldn't send anyone because it's war in Ukraine, it's not on the time. But on the other hand, many people all over the globe still don't understand the difference between Ukraine and Russia. They think that what is it about? Don't they speak the same language? Don't they have the same music? So for us, it's crucial that we have representatives, and Ukrainian people are really talented. I mean, I don't say that British people or French people are not talented, but we sing all the time. It's in our blood. We cook, we sing. We iron, we sing. We do everything, we sing. And it's so natural for us to be in this song contest. It's so natural to participate, and for me I'm very excited to go there. Actually, I work in National Broadcasting Company for radio station Promień, which is translated as Ray, and we are official partner of the event. And it's interesting that the song of Jerry Hale and Alona for this year sounds like "Z nami Mama Teresa, Diva Maria," and etc. And my children, I have 3 of them, they are still very young, daughters 4 and 6 years old. They don't understand who is Maria and Teresa because they never had this context. And they just phonetically hear it like "Z nami Mama Teresa, Diva Maria." And you know how it's translated? Our sober mother is with us, and there is a coach and an oil. Mama, mother, Teresa, sober, Divan, a coach, a sofa, and Olia, oil. So it's very funny that actually a song about such powerful women is heard by my children. A sober mother is with us. I think that should be my blog from Eurovision from Malmö when I'm there. Hey, sober mother is with you. Let's speak about Eurovision.
Well, rest assured we will be covering this year's contest on the podcast. Anna, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to meet you and to talk to you, and looking forward to the next opportunities to tell you more about pagan culture.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.